as I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, we really believe that all remote is the future of work, but with this current situation, of course, external forces rush its implementation for a lot of companies. So it's definitely a challenge, and it has some challenges. And one of the questions I get asked a lot is like, how do you establish this remote culture, but also how do you align with everybody if they're in 68 countries, or if you have like a big or a small team, or if you're just not used to working remote. So I hope to give you a bit of an insight in how we did it at Gitlab. So how to establish that culture? Well, the way Gitlab looks at culture is with team members in 68 countries, we really see it as you have two types of culture you have to take into account. So workplace culture and personal culture. Because you have to be very explicit on what you mean, because sometimes for somebody in the Netherlands, something can mean something totally different than for somebody in maybe in China or in India or in the United States. So that's why we are really explicit with our culture. And this presentation is going to focus on workplace culture. But it's definitely important to maintain a sensible or a stable sense for both if you're working remotely. Okay, so what we did in creating a work culture at Gitlab is we really believe it's driven by values. So and values can only shape the organization if they're respected and lived by everybody and every team member. Or maybe, as you noticed, with less physical interaction, it's harder, or you have less buffer to compensate for indifferences towards company values. So you have to be very explicit with your company values. And we believe that if you set the right values, you document those, they're a universal North Star. So everybody across the globe can use it as a sort of a guide. At Gitlab, we saw that the product of Gitlab, so where you can collaborate on software, aligns with our mission. So we believe that everybody can contribute. That's our mission. And that also should align with our values. So this is really how we set up those values, and also make sure that they facilitate how we work remotely. There's this page in our handbook where you can see how we wrote out all the values. The Gitlab values are credit. That's the acronym. So it stands for collaboration, results, efficiency, diversity and inclusion, iteration, and transparency. And all of these values really align with our mission and the product of Gitlab. So if you have established those values, probably all of you have those values already for your organization, but then it's very important to sustain them in the workplace culture. So even if you're remote, this should really be something you focus a lot on and you are very explicit about. So we use those values and reinforce them by a lot of things, but I wrote down a couple in this slide. So leadership is a real ambassador for our values. We select on our values during hiring process. We emphasize on them during our onboarding, but we also use our values to promote people, to give feedback, and also manage underperformance. We even have this thing which is called discretionary bonus. I'm not sure it's very common in the Netherlands, but I think it might be a bit more common for US. So you can nominate colleagues or team members for a discretionary bonus if they really exemplified one of the Gitlab values. And the discretionary bonus is $1,000, and you really have to write up like, hey, Rune really showed the collaboration value over this process, and then you can nominate your team members. So that really works. So we really put our money where our mouth is, right, in terms of our values. In terms of culture and values, we think you should put a structure around it. So I think sometimes culture is seen as this implicit thing, but actually if you're remote and if you want to sustain your culture, you cannot have it as an implicit thing, and you also cannot have unwritten rules, right? You have to be very explicit, because the implicit is not existing, because nobody's in an office space. So you have to write everything down and be very clear in your expectations. So, and structure your culture. And we also think you should never take it for granted, because it's a very important part for team members to create a sense of belonging if they're remote. So our values in communication. So we communicate a lot via text mostly. And of course we also have meetings, but a lot via text. And we also believe that values should be translated or shown in your communication. So we even have like a communication guide in our handbook where we would say like, always assume positive intent when with written communication, say thanks, assume kindness. It's impossible to know everything. So people ask a lot of questions. And I think GitLab is really the place where everybody has short toes. One of the things in culture, I think is also important to have like a healthy culture, right? And enforce or embrace a healthy practices. So one of the challenges for remote working can be that people experience isolation or anxiety or a burnout because work and home are very much intertwined. And it's very easy to pick up on your laptop because you always have it with you and think like, hey, I'm going to do a lot of work on the weekend, or I'm going to work 100 hours, because that could be something people are comfortable to do. But actually at GitLab, we really focus on prioritizing mental health, and we don't want to celebrate long hours. We document processes around mental health, and we have an employee assistance program, which is a tool, Modern Health it's called, and you can connect with coaches all around the world to help you, for example, prevent burnout. If you feel isolated or lonely, they can also help you getting into practices to prevent that from happening. So if we're looking at mental health and healthy culture, we encourage a lot to set boundaries between home and work, take vacation. So we use a Slack tool, which is called PTO Ninja, which even sends you reminders to take a break or to take a holiday. Switch off when you're away from work. Don't suffer in silence. So we really think you should, if you feel this, you should really speak up about it. Because if you're in a not in an office altogether, it's harder to notice something if somebody doesn't speak up. We have some more practices in there which can help you prevent this. And as I also mentioned, we really encourage a healthy remote work lifestyle. So schedule breaks, leverage video to connect face-to-face with your colleagues, or also informal coffee chats and that sort of things. Engage with colleagues on non-work topics. So one of the things I put in there as an example is, is actually last weekend, I became an auntie for the second time. And actually I shared this like with the whole people group. And everybody was really like supportive and of that. So we really, outside of work, we also share a lot of non-work related things, which is really culture and really encouraged by our culture. So that was a bit on the values and the culture and how you align your company mission to your values, and how you can encourage a healthy culture outside of work. But one of the questions I get a lot is how do you align then across the company? Because if you're not in the same office, how can you make sure that everybody's aware of everything that's happening? So I wanted to quickly touch on that as well, because what we do at GitLab is really structured communications. As I mentioned, communication by text is key. And we really want to make sure that all our communication is low context. So that means that you don't have to have a lot of context to be able to understand what is written down. We also define which channels we use for what. So for example, Slack is more of the informal communication channel, while Gitlab itself, because we also use Gitlab ourselves a lot, is more around like work-related things and pushing through projects and making updates to the handbook. And we also really are a firm believer about structuring informal communication too. So we have informal Slack channels. We have Ask Me Anything sessions, mostly with like leadership, like our CEO or EVP of engineering. We have Q&A sessions. We even have a kids talent show within the people group. So everybody their kids was going to perform. And that's also where this screenshot is from. So structuring these communications really helps you to align and making sure that everybody's aware. What also really works for us is that we have a handbook-first approach. So I mentioned this handbook a couple of times before. So our handbook is super important. It's a living document and it's a website. It's online. It's open to everybody. So everybody can read it, not only people working at Gitlab, but the whole world. And generally, this handbook has all the information in there you need. So from our values, communication guidelines, but also to, for example, which template do I use for webinars, or that sort of things, our code of conduct. And everybody can collaborate and work on the handbook. So actually, we have about 50 to 100 updates a day to our handbook with like, it's either anything from a small typo fix to adding like complete sections to the handbook. And it's very different from what I'm used to in HR, or where you would have a handbook, you maybe update that once a quarter, maybe once a year. But at Gitlab, it's really a living document. So everybody has access to the same information. And we use our handbook as a single source of truth. So that means that the truth is in the handbook and it's not in another document, or maybe in a Slack channel or anything. We also established a handbook guide. So if you want to update your handbook or maybe make it an online handbook, that could really help you. One of the things on aligning is also that, so outside the structuring the communications, having that handbook in place, which everybody uses and contributes to, we also embrace asynchronous workflows. So synchronous communication is what we have right now, right? So we are having a call, everybody's in the same call at the same time. So that's synchronous. And asynchronous communication or asynchronous workflows is all about, I could do some work right now. So maybe I can work on a new policy for webinars. Then when my colleagues wake up in the US, they can take it over and they can look at it, review it, and do some additional work on it. And then in the morning, my morning, APAC region, so a colleague in the APAC region can take over and do some additional work, provide some feedback. And when I wake up tomorrow, I will have like this whole project be taken forward by colleagues. So that's asynchronous working. So you're not working at the same thing at the same time. So on that tool stack, I quickly wanted to touch on this because there's a lot of questions around like, hey, how many tools do you use? And where do you use it? And how do you add tools? So to make it easy and accessible and efficient, we want to limit our tool stack as much as possible. So we use Zoom for all our videos. We use Slack for informal communication. Then we use Gitlab to work in, and we use G Suite for email, calendar, and documents, sharing documents. And then we have, from an HR perspective, we have Bamboo HR and Culture Amp. And this is actually, I would say 90% of our tool stack, or maybe 95. And if we don't want to add a lot of tools, because then people have to check a lot of tools and then to be up to date. So actually we want to limit our tool stack as much as possible, so everybody has a quick overview of where the work takes place. I think it was a lot of information. So quick takeaways. We really believe that work culture, but definitely in a remote environment, is driven by values. You should structure your culture, structure communication, and keep on iterating. So as we do with our handbook, constantly iterate. It's never set in stone. So one of the things we're considering now is updating our values of diversity and inclusion, for example, and add belonging to there. So that's, I think it's a continuous process, and we really approach thing as a living document. Create this handbook, and I think from a culture perspective, and how to, if you already have a culture and values, but how to make that transformation to remote, I think there should be no unwritten rules. So make sure to write everything down, and share that across your company. Make mental health a priority. Structure your communication, as I said, limit your tool stack, and consistently also refer back to your values to sustain your culture. So Gitlab believes in a world where everybody can contribute. So as I mentioned in the beginning, our remote working playbook is public, as well as that we have a website on our remote practices. So if there's anything you want to look up, probably the best information would be in that playbook or on that website. And to close this off, we think the world is moving towards remote, and that's definitely, I think, this situation, as unfortunate as it is, but I do think there's a push in there to move towards remote. So we are witnessing history, and we believe that this is the world post-office. Thank you all.